Alright, so when we last left off, we were actually seeing okay, so when we last left off, we were looking at that whole sliding filament mechanism. So we were really trying to understand how these molecules inside the myofibril, inside the muscle cell, inside the fascicle, inside the muscle itself, actually shortens. And so it's that sliding filament mechanism. So remember that we need all of the different components, and we need to know what they do. Actin, myosin, tropomyosin, troponin, calcium, ATP, etc. Okay? And one of the things that relates to that, as we start off this segment, kind of scaling our way back up, is you hear about rigor mortis. So rigor mortis, right? Rigor, you're basically locked up after death. And so what happens here is that the ATP and its role in sliding filament mechanism, remember when we use the ATP, that allows the head to detach and then go into its cocked position, right? So it's got that stored energy ready to go. Well, if we don't have an ATP molecule that's going to bind to the myosin head and allow it to detach from the actin filament, then our muscles are locked up. So it's only after about 24 hours or maybe longer that rigor mortis starts to go away. And so in the days following, as the muscle fibers and the proteins actually break down, then as they fall apart, then the muscles will get more pliable again. Okay. So, don't mean to start on a down note there, but it ties into what we were talking about in terms of the role of each of those different molecules and ions. Alright, so we're going to scale back up again. So we're moving out from an individual myofibril, and we're starting to look then again at individual muscle cells, and how, remember, these cells are part of fascicles like we see here, and how those fascicles, those bundles, make up the entire muscle. So in order to get these cells to do their job, we said the motor neuron is going to go down, it's going to stimulate it at the motor end plate, and then the action potential is going to be generated. It's going to go down those T-tubules. We're going to cause the calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that whole sliding filament mechanism is going to occur. But it's not a one-to-one relationship where we have one neuron that's stimulating one muscle cell. In fact, we have this functional unit in terms of a neuromuscular functional unit that's called the motor unit, and it's defined as one motor neuron. A motor neuron is actually what's called an efferent neuron. It is controlling basically the skeletal muscle in this case, or smooth muscle, etc. But basically it's going out and it's relaying that signal from the nervous system to the muscle and telling it what to do. And so it's one neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it controls or innervates. So it's a bit like a puppet master. So it's going to have an axon going down, and the axon is going to branch, and it's going to branch, and it's going to then make connections with multiple fibers. And it depends on the type of muscle it is and how much of fine motor control we need, like in the hands and the fingers, very fine motor control do we need. Talking about muscles of the torso or something like that, or the thigh, we don't need fine motor control. So fine motor control comes from controlling just a few, if you will, a handful of these muscle cells at a time. And so we can very precisely control the use of those muscle cells inside of a whole muscle. Or is it like we're just kind of calling in to play a whole army of cells at once? So definitely in definition you need to know a motor unit is one motor neuron and then all of the muscle fibers that it innervates. All right. So when the cells are getting contracted, we understand what's going on inside of the cells now. So now we're kind of scaling back up again to the muscle itself. So when the muscle contracts, it's going to produce tension, right? So remember that the muscles, particularly the skeletal muscles, are attached to at least two places on the skeleton. And so it's going to start pulling on those. Now when it does so, it may or may not shorten the muscle. So that seems kind of confusing, right? Because we have the whole idea that we're going to contract and we're going to relax, and we're going to contract and we're going to relax. And that's true. But the question is, are we going to shorten? So that's going to be dependent on kind of the load that these muscles are trying to move. So imagine, if you will, that you wanted to move a car, right? So you go up to the bumper and you grab onto it and you are working to tighten those muscles and contract those muscles, etc. Well, if your muscles actually shortened, then the car would lift up and hey, that would be a story for the news, etc. But if the load is too much, we can tighten, if you will, and contract all those muscle cells that we can, and that load is still going to be too much for our cells to overcome. So anyway, so there's a couple different types of contractions. One's called isometric, and the other one's called isotonic. Now the iso part itself means the same, right? Like an isosceles triangle has two sides that are the same. So iso means the same. Metric, right? Think about metric in terms of a length, and then tonic is more of the tension. So isometric contraction means that the length stays the same. So like if I'm doing this right now and I'm going, oh, and I'm contracting, right? My biceps brachii as well as a few other muscles. But you can see that we're not actually shortening. You don't see my forelimb moving. So that type of contraction is an isometric contraction. And then an isotonic contraction is where we've generated enough tension to move that load, and so the muscle is going to shorten. So I don't have much load here. It's just the weight, if you will, of my forearm. And so when I contract this muscle, if I generate enough force, then it's going to cause that joint to move. Okay? So that's going to be an isotonic contraction because we start out by generating force just a little bit, and maybe the limb isn't going to move, but at some point we're going to generate enough force. Now this limb's going to move. We're going to pick up the suitcase or something like that. At that point, we're not going to need to generate any more tension because we have achieved the movement that we want. And so we call this an isotonic contraction at that point, where the muscle is shortening, but the tension stays the same because we don't need to generate anymore. Okay, we'll come back to that as well. So when we're stimulating these muscles, right, we know what happens, but how does the muscle respond? And on a very simple and shortest level, it produces a twitch, right? So sometimes you think about a muscle twitch, like you're like, oh, I got an eye twitch, I wish that would go away, etc. That may have to do with, again, an imbalance, like an ion imbalance or a neurotransmitter issue or a nerve issue or something like that, or neuron issue. But a muscle twitch is actually a simple contraction that we normally think about it for a muscle. And that means one threshold stimulus, one stimulus that gets to those skeletal muscle cells by a motor unit, right? A motor neuron going down to that motor unit. And then as fast as we stimulate it, then we stop stimulating it. So it's going to respond and it's going to produce a short contraction, and then it's going to go and relax again. And you can look at that on a graph and it looks kind of like this. So notice that we're seeing time on the x-axis here, and then we're seeing tension or percentage of maximal tension on the y-axis. Now notice this time is in milliseconds, right? So milliseconds. So if we have 100 milliseconds, that's 1/10 of a second. Okay? So this is very, very fast, even though it's spread over on this graph. So what we're seeing is, along this area right here, where it's in dark blue, we have stimulated the cell, right? Because we stimulated at time 0 right here. We've stimulated the cell, but we're not seeing any tension, right? So this is where that whole mechanism that we talked about in terms of stimulating the cell with neurotransmitters, diffusing across the cleft, generating an action potential with our different types of sodium channels, spreading along the surface, going in the T tubules, calcium being released. That takes time. It takes time for me to just say it, right? So it's not a lot of time, but on the order of a handful of milliseconds, it takes a while for the myofibrils and those different proteins to get the signal that it's time to contract. So that's called the latent period. We've initiated the contraction, but we're not seeing a response yet. Then we get the period of contraction where we see tension going up, okay? And then when it levels off up here, we go into a relaxation phase. And you see the tension generates very quickly, and then it takes a little while for everything to kind of unroll again and separate. So this basically goes over what we were talking about there. The latent period is where we are stimulating it. The period of contraction is when the cross bridges are doing their job, right? Thick and thin filaments. And then the period of relaxation is when the calcium is being taken back up into the sarcoplasmic reticulum and those heads are detaching and going back to their original length. Now you'll notice when we look at twitches it's going to be different in different muscles. There's actually different muscle types, not only smooth and cardiac and skeletal, but there's different fiber types as well. We'll talk about that later on. It's slow twitch, fast twitch, etc. It has to do with whole structure and function, what these muscles are needing to do. So for instance, if we look at the extraocular muscles, right? The extraocular muscles, those are the muscles attaching to the surface of the eye, right? They do a lot of quick movements, especially when you're reading, doing saccades, etc. And then if we look at other muscles which are bigger and have kind of larger scale actions, so gastrocnemius, right? So that's your calf muscle. Soleus is going to be the muscle that's deep to that. They also have different response times. They're bigger. We don't need to be taking off really, really quickly, not as fast as we would need the eye to move, etc. Okay, so when we are stimulating these cells to contract, they're going to produce a response. They're going to generate tension. But usually it's not just a twitch like that, right? Usually it's more of some sort of sustained contraction. And we get what's called a graded muscle response. So you think about grades occur like on a curve, right? Not that the grades are curved. Don't think about our grades being curved. But you think about a grade distribution like a bell curve. So it kind of changes gradually, and that's kind of what we see in terms of normal muscle responses as well. And the response by the muscle can be affected by the frequency of stimulation or the strength of the stimulation as well. So again, when we look at a single twitch, we see that we stimulate it at time 0, and then it's going to respond, and then it's going to relax, and that's about all we get. So from one twitch, we stop stimulating, it immediately has to go into a relaxation phase. But what if, before it gets to a relaxation phase, we hit it again? So we stimulate it again, and then it bumps it up. So it's kind of like, if you have a balloon or something like that, right? If you are bumping it or you're blowing it, right? You blow it up once. Before it gets all the way down again, you blow on it again. It may get higher the second time. So that's what happens when we increase the frequency of stimulation. What we see is before this one totally gets back down to a relaxation state, we hit it again, and now it builds. So we see this stair stepping as we generate more and more tension or more and more force. Now, if you are stimulating it so quickly that it doesn't have a chance to relax at all, then you get this maximal state of sustained tension that we call tetanus. Now the other one kind of is tetanus as well because it builds like that, but this one's called a fused or complete tetanus where we don't see any of those hills and valleys, etc. So we're hitting it so many times it just like, locks up. Now you think about tetanus, you're like, lockjaw, I get it. But this tetanus is normal, right? So for instance, if we are looking to, like we said, carry a big suitcase or something like that, you may need to generate a whole bunch of force and recruit a lot of these different motor units, etc., and use a maximum amount of tension because it's heavy. And then you're going to maintain that tension for a period of time until you set the suitcase down or the muscle fatigues and it has to relax. So that's kind of what we're going to see. We're going to say, okay, we need to carry the suitcase because we have to stimulate all these muscle cells, and they're going to do their best to contract and generate that force, and that produces tetanus. So it's not abnormal. In fact, it's used very regularly. Okay, so what we find is that, number one, we can change the frequency, and that then kind of builds tension, but you can also do what's called recruitment, so increase your strength. And I always think about this one in terms of like military, etc. So if we need more strength, we need more individuals, we're going to recruit more individuals, we're going to have a bigger army, that's going to provide a bigger force, right? So that also is what happens. So not just one motor unit, stimulating a handful, like 10 cells inside of a muscle, we're going to recruit more and more of the cells that are inside of that particular muscle. So it kind of depends on the strength of the stimulus as to how many. Like when we're putting out this call for recruitment and a call for help, if it's a weak stimulus and a weak call, you may get a few trickling in. But if it's a loud, alarming call in terms of a neural stimulation, then you're going to get a bigger response. So we'll see that in terms of these stimuli. So subthreshold stimulus, you haven't quite got it up to the level. Like if you're calling for help, that's so soft that nobody's going to get the signal. Threshold, it's loud enough that people are going to hear it, and you may get some coming over. And then we have maximal stimulus where it's like, I'm freaking out here and I am, air horns and whistling and stuff like that. I'm going to get a big response. So when we look at it, it can look like this. So here, This is stimulus voltage, and then the stimuli to the nerve. So when we look at it, we're looking at the strength of these, and here's a threshold line right here. So it has to be at least that strong in order to get the muscle cells to respond. So these ones down here, when we look at the muscle cells and how they respond and how many respond, that's not a strong enough signal. That's like me, being very quiet in terms of saying help, right? You're not going to get any response. Once you reach threshold, now we see more motor units responding, and the stronger the signal, more and more motor units are recruited until basically everybody is involved, right? Calling all cars, we need everybody. And that's when you're going to get the largest force being generated as well. Okay? Now, one of the interesting things about this is, again, you try not to call all of your forces in at once, because what happens then? They're going to get tired, and if they're all fighting at the same time or all doing their work at the same time, they're all going to get tired at the same time. So you're not going to be able to sustain that action. So oftentimes what happens is we will use a subset of cells inside of a muscle, and then we'll rotate. It's like, you guys are doing the work for a while. Before you guys get tired, okay, let's swap out and use these ones over here for a while. And before those get tired, we use these ones over here for a while. Unless it's something that's super heavy and we need everything at once, that type of rotating use of different motor units allows us to produce a longer action by that muscle. Okay, so this recruitment as well, based on the response you need, not only do you look at the number, but you look at the strength too. So if you need a little force, then you start calling in the smallest muscle fibers, okay? And the smallest motor units. And so then if you need more, then you're going to recruit ones that have bigger muscle cells and that are bigger motor units, etc. So we also see that increase in tension as we will increase the size, right? If you're just having a little battle, you may only need these guys. But if you're having a big battle or a big war, you're going to need your biggest, strongest guys, your biggest, strongest cells. Now this part is interesting as well. You know how we were talking about tetanus, and you're like, I didn't understand that tetanus means something different than what I thought before. It's not just like, botulism and stuff like that. It's actually got a definition for a normal contracted state, maximally contracted state of a muscle. There's also this state that's called muscle tone, where it's a partially contracted state. And so, people think about, they're looking at this fit individual and they look very toned, etc. Actually muscle tone is a partial state of contraction of these myofibrils and muscle cells. And so it kind of keeps them at the ready. They're not fully relaxed and they're not fully contracted. They're somewhere in between. And that way, it has a few different functions. Number one, that way they're ready for anything. They can contract more, or they can relax from wherever they're sitting in that partially contracted state. Okay? And that means that we're ready to produce force if we need to, or relax that muscle a little bit more if you need to. But also remember that contracting muscles generate heat, and that's important for an endothermic organism. So we need to generate that heat to maintain our 98.6 degrees inside. So, in fact, if you're cold and we contract muscle, right, you shiver, you might even increase your overall muscle tone so that they're more contracted, and that will generate more heat. And the opposite is true as well. So, for instance, if you're in Arizona in the summer and you're like, oh, it's so hot, I just feel lethargic, I can't move, etc., that often has to do with the fact that your muscle tone is much more relaxed. So we're allowing those myofibrils and those muscle filaments to not quite be as overlapped or as contracted, and that's then going to generate less heat, right? They're not quite as ready, but that also makes you feel a little bit more, kind of relaxed overall. Okay, so we talked about different types of contractions. We talked about when the tension stays the same, when the length stays the same, etc. There are a couple other ones that you may have heard of or that you need to know in terms of subcategories. Isotonic contractions, like we said, the muscle is going to shorten, but the tension is going to stay the same. Now, this can occur in the normal way that you would think of, where the muscle is going to shorten, but in fact, with an isotonic contraction where the length is changing, it could actually lengthen as opposed to shorten. So, for instance, right, we talk about the biceps brachii to pick up a book, or even just pick up the weight of your limb like this. But say I wanted to set that book down. So I don't want to just drop it. I don't want to make a loud noise or break it or something like that. So as I let it slowly down, I'm doing a controlled extension of that joint, and I have to contract my muscles in order to do it. So I'm doing contraction, but the muscle is lengthening. So imagine, if you will, like, remember we had this whole analogy of the tug of war rope? So imagine, if you will, that you were, kind of lowering somebody down, like you were hiking or something like that, or climbing, rock climbing, and you were lowering somebody down. You don't want to just let go and they go, right? So what you're going to do is, you are, in a very controlled way, you're going to let that rope or let that filament go away from you, and you're going to use muscle tension to do that. So that's the same thing when your muscles they have tension, but they are lengthening instead. So that's called an eccentric contraction, as opposed to a concentric contraction. Okay, but in either case, like we see here, the length of the muscle is changing in an isotonic contraction. Okay, and then isometric contraction, like we said, that's where the length is staying the same, but the tension is changing. So again, this is if you are, you're going on a trip and you're like, oh, I gotta go get the suitcase, I gotta go pick it up. When you first grab the handle, you don't know exactly how heavy it's gonna be, and so you generate a little bit of force, and then you're like, oh my gosh, it's not moving. And then you generate more force, right? Recruit more of your different motor units, etc. Still not moving. More force, more motor units. Now, all of a sudden, the suitcase starts to lift and you pick it up. During that time when you're generating force but the suitcase isn't lifting and the muscle isn't shortening, that is an isometric contraction, okay? But once you pick up that suitcase and it starts moving, now you've changed over to an isotonic contraction instead. We don't need to generate or change any more tension, but now the length is going to change instead, okay? Okay. So, like we said, there's a variety of kind of fine-tuned actions that are going on between those different filaments, between the thick filaments and the thin filaments, in order to allow these types of contractions to occur. So this one that we see here is an isometric contraction, where we're generating force, but that muscle is not changing length because the weight or the load at the bottom is too much. Okay? Okay. So I think we'll stop there for now. Again, we're kind of getting into the fine details about how muscles as a larger scale, as they work. And now we're going to, in the next segment, talk about where do we get all this energy. We talk about energy for the myosin heads and stuff like that. We use a lot of ATP to do that. Where does all this ATP come from? Some places some places are actually going to be new. So we'll see that coming up in the next segment.